his ancient maps, which show the world as it looked during the last ice age. We're talking about maps that were drawn roughly between the 1300s and the 1700s.
What if maps drawn 500 years ago captured the world with a level of accuracy we only reached after putting satellites into space? Graham Hancock has warned for years that these charts weren't lucky guesses. They're the last traces of a more advanced civilization erased by a global disaster. And they point to a chapter of history we never knew existed. Graham Hancock and the battle over our past. In the spring of 2024, a huge audience watched Graham Hancock sit across from archaeologist Flint Dibble on the Joe Rogan podcast. For hours, they argued about the same thing Hancock has been talking about for decades: a lost chapter of human history, and the old maps, he says, point to it. Dibble brought degrees, digs, and the backing of university labs. Hancock brought best-selling books, a global fan base, and a sharp claim that many people find hard to shake. The story we have been taught about the past is not complete. That clash shows why Graham Hancock makes so many people angry and so many others excited. To his fans, he is the man brave enough to say out loud that our timeline might be wrong. To a lot of archaeologists, he is a writer who builds big claims on weak foundations and then presents them as fact. Either way, he is not easy to ignore, and the fight around his ideas has only grown louder since that debate. Hancock did not begin his career in ancient ruins. He was born in Edinburgh in 1950, grew up partly in India, and came back to Britain to study sociology at Durham University. Instead of going straight into fringe history, he went into journalism. He worked for major British papers such as The Times and The Guardian, and served as East Africa correspondent for The Economist. His early books attacked the global aid system in works like Lords of Poverty, giving him a reputation as a reporter who asked hard questions and did not mind upsetting powerful institutions. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, his focus shifted. Hancock became fascinated by old religious stories and the idea that something crucial had been lost in the deep past. He went looking for the Ark of the Covenant in Ethiopia, visited temple sites, and dug into myths. Step by step, he moved away from normal political reporting and toward a new role as a kind of detective of forgotten civilizations. The big turn came with Fingerprints of the Gods in the mid-1990s. In that book, Hancock argued that an advanced, seagoing civilization existed long before ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. In his view, this was a global, ocean-based culture that knew the true shape of the Earth, tracked the stars with great skill, and may even have had technology we would recognize today. He believes a huge natural disaster near the end of the last ice age almost wiped them out. A sudden global shock around 12,000 years ago that smashed their world and broke human memory. Most archaeologists and climate scientists strongly disagree. They see no solid evidence for a lost high-tech civilization, and no single disaster that reset human history. Hancock, however, has doubled down over the years. In later work, such as Magicians of the Gods and in his television series Ancient Apocalypse, he describes survivors of that early catastrophe as teachers who sailed around the world, passing fragments of their knowledge to later cultures. He says they helped light the spark for complex societies in places like Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Americas, bringing geometry, astronomy, and the skills needed to measure and map the Earth. That is where the backlash really begins. Archaeologists and historians say there is no hard evidence for these hidden teachers, and warn that taking credit away from indigenous builders and giving it to a vague lost group echoes old racist stories about outside civilizers. When Ancient Apocalypse came out on Netflix, the Society for American Archaeology wrote an open letter asking Netflix to stop calling it a documentary and to label it as fiction. They argued that the show misleads viewers, attacks working archaeologists, and leans on ideas that have been tied in the past to white supremacist myths. Hancock answers by saying he respects indigenous cultures and is being punished for asking forbidden questions. In his view, the harsh tone of the response proves that the academic world is more interested in protecting its timelines than in testing new ideas. He tells his audience that instead of open debate, his critics try to shut him down and brand his work as dangerous. All of this sets the stage for why old maps have become such a pressure point. Hancock knows that myths and ruins can be brushed aside as symbols or accidents, but a map can be laid over a modern globe. Coastlines either match or they do not. River mouths either line up or they do not. For him, that makes maps the cleanest test of his claim that someone, long before written history, charted the world in careful detail. Over and over, he points to a small group of early world charts made in Europe and the wider Mediterranean world during the age of sailing. One of them, drawn by an Ottoman admiral about 500 years ago, now sits at the center of the fight, and turns the argument over Hancock's ideas into a very sharp question about how such a map was even possible in the first place. The Piri Reis map and Hancock's big claim. That ancient map is a torn piece of parchment sitting in a glass case in Istanbul. The part that survived is roughly 34 inches by 25 inches, drawn on animal skin, covered with ships, sea monsters, and tight handwriting. It is dated 1513 and signed by an Ottoman naval officer named Piri Reis. Only about 1/3 of the original world map is still there, but even that surviving piece has caused arguments for almost 100 years. The piece we have today turned up by accident in 1929. The old Topkapi Palace in Istanbul was being turned into a museum, and staff were going through piles of rolled-up documents. Inside one bundle, scholars found this colored sea chart of the Atlantic with a note saying it was drawn in the year 919 of the Islamic calendar, which matches 1513 in the modern calendar. Very quickly, experts realized two things. First, it was one of the oldest detailed maps ever found that showed the Americas. Second, it seemed far too good for its time. For Hancock, this map is not just an old drawing. It is a clue that points to a much older level of knowledge that official history has missed. To understand why Hancock cares so much, you have to look at who Piri Reis actually was. Piri was born around 1470 in the Ottoman Empire. His uncle, Kemal Reis, was a famous corsair and later a navy commander. As a young man, Piri sailed with him across the Mediterranean, raiding, escorting fleets, and learning how to pilot real ships in real war. Later, Piri became an admiral himself and took part in major campaigns, including the Ottoman push into Egypt. He was not a monk in a study copying old pictures. He was a working sailor whose life depended on good charts. On top of that, Piri wrote a huge sea book called the Kitab-i Bahriye, often translated as Book of the Sea or Book of Navigation. It is part pilot guide and part atlas. It describes harbors, currents, winds, and coasts, with small maps to match. This tells us something important that Hancock likes to stress. Piri Reis was serious about navigation. He was the kind of person who would collect every scrap of coastal knowledge he could find and try to turn it into something a captain could trust on the open water. On the surviving world map, Piri wrote notes along the edges explaining where his information came from. In one long note, he says he used about 20 earlier charts and maps of the world. He mentions older Arabic and Indian maps, Portuguese charts from the new voyages along Africa and Brazil, and at least one chart made by Christopher Columbus. According to Piri, that Columbus map came from a Spanish ship captured by his uncle around 1501. This is the part that really catches Hancock's eye. For him, this is not just a sailor copying other sailors. It is a sign that Piri is sitting at the end of a very long chain of copying, where each new map sits on top of older ones. Hancock argues that if Piri's sources already looked old and strange to him in 1513, some of those earlier charts might in fact go back thousands of years, to a time when a lost seagoing civilization had mapped the world in detail. Even without that leap, the Piri Reis fragment is impressive. The piece we have shows the western coasts of Europe and Africa, most of the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and a long stretch of the east coast of South America. For something drawn only about 21 years after Columbus first reached the Americas, the shape of the Brazilian bulge, many capes, and the position of several islands are surprisingly close to modern maps. The style of the map tells you what it was made for. It is a sea chart. You can see compass roses and straight lines crossing the water in every direction. These are sailing lines that help a pilot keep a steady course by following a fixed compass heading from one spot to another. Unlike later maps, there is no grid of latitude and longitude. The focus is not on drawing the whole globe perfectly. It is on giving sailors a useful picture of coasts and routes. Hancock agrees that Piri Reis was drawing for sailors, but he says there is more going on in the drawing, especially at the bottom. Here, the parchment shows a large landmass stretching under the Atlantic. On first glance, it looks like an odd extension of South America mixed with a generic southern land. In the 1960s, a history teacher named Charles Hapgood stared at that same area and came to a fascinating conclusion. Hapgood argued that this southern shape was actually a view of Antarctica before it was covered by thick ice. In his book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, he claimed that when you line up that bottom coastline with modern maps and tilt things a bit, parts of it look like sections of the Antarctic coast, especially the area we now call Queen Maud Land. Hapgood also shared a letter he received in 1960 from Colonel Harold Ohlmeyer of the U.S. Air Force. In the letter, Ohlmeyer said the coastal line Hapgood pointed to looked remarkably like the Antarctic coast as shown by new seismic surveys of the time. When Graham Hancock read Hapgood, he felt that this was exactly the kind of hard clue he had been looking for. In Hancock's books and talks, the Piri Reis map quickly becomes a key exhibit. Hancock repeats Hapgood's claim that the map shows an ice-free Antarctica and says this fits perfectly with his idea of a lost Ice Age civilization. In Hancock's version, that civilization had the skill to chart the coast of Antarctica when its edges were open water, and then later mapmakers like Piri Reis inherited those old charts without really knowing what they were. But when modern polar scientists and map experts look at this, they see a different picture. Studies of the Antarctic ice sheet show that large parts of the continent have been under thick ice for tens of millions of years. Work with rock cores and climate models suggests that permanent ice began to build up around 34 million years ago. Some buried landscapes under today's ice, like old river systems in East Antarctica, have been hidden for between 80 million and 34 million years. That time scale matters. Our own species has only been around for a few 100,000 years. Even the earliest widely accepted stone tools made by human ancestors are a couple of million years old, not tens of millions. There is no evidence that human beings, or anything like us, were sailing around an ice-free Antarctica, drawing coastal surveys when those buried river plains were still on the surface. From a scientific standpoint, Antarctica has not been open for anyone to explore for at least 12,000 years. It was already covered in deep ice long before that. Professional map historians also push back on the Antarctica reading from a different angle. Gregory McIntosh, who wrote a detailed study of the Piri Reis map, points out that the southern land on the parchment fits well with a common idea in Renaissance mapmaking called Terra Australis, a huge imagined southern continent that mapmakers added to balance out the land they knew existed in the north. In his view, the lower coast is mostly a stretched and twisted South America joined to this imagined southern land, not a careful plot of a real Antarctic shoreline. McIntosh and others also note that while parts of the Piri Reis map look good, other parts are clearly wrong. Some islands are misplaced. Proportions are off. The grid of sailing lines, which was very useful for pilots, also tends to bend and distort coasts when you try to lay the old chart over a globe. When you understand those built-in distortions, the match to Antarctica becomes much weaker. Hancock does not accept that answer. From his point of view, those mistakes do not erase the bigger point. He keeps coming back to two things: how early the map is and how strong some of the matches are along the Atlantic. He notes that the coastline of Brazil on the Piri Reis map looks better than you might expect just a couple of decades after the first Portuguese landings. He points to bays and capes that line up fairly well with modern charts, and argues that the overall picture feels like the work of someone who had access to much more complete source material than the voyages of that time could provide. Because of that, Hancock still treats the Piri Reis chart as one of his strongest pieces of circumstantial evidence. From here, Hancock moves on to claim that many other old charts, drawn in different countries and languages, are all preserving bits of a forgotten world. The Older Map Network. Behind Hancock's claims. The first big group Hancock loves to talk about are the Portolan charts. These were working sea maps that appeared around the late 13th and 14th centuries in the Mediterranean. They show coastlines, harbors, and sailing routes in amazing detail, with a web of straight lines crossing the map like a spider's web. Those lines are rum lines that show directions from a compass. The strange thing is how good the shorelines already look on the earliest surviving examples. Historians like Tony Campbell say that the Mediterranean on these old maps is drawn so accurately that map makers did not make it much better for many hundreds of years. Scholars still argue over how such accurate charts appeared so quickly. One side says medieval captains spent generations sailing every inlet and bay, used the magnetic compass, and slowly turned all that experience into charts. Another group of researchers notes that we do not really see a clear buildup of bad or rough maps before the first good ones. The Portolan charts arrive already very polished. For Hancock, that jump is the interesting part. He suggests that medieval map makers may have been copying parts of much older coastal surveys without really knowing how those first surveys were done. Mainstream historians do not accept his idea, but they do agree that the origin of the Portolan style is still a real historical puzzle. Hancock then widens the picture. He points to later world maps that seem to carry hints of the same deep knowledge. One of his favorites is by the French mathematician and mapmaker Orance Fine in the 1500s. Fine drew the world on a heart-shaped frame, a type of design called a cordiform projection. On it, he showed Europe, Africa, and Asia with the best information of his time, and then added a giant imagined southern land, Terra Australis, stretching around the bottom of the globe. A few decades later, the Flemish mapmaker Gerardus Mercator published his famous world map of 1569. Mercator's big innovation was not just the picture of the world, but the way he drew it. He created a grid where north-south lines and east-west lines are straight and cross at right angles, and where compass courses show up as straight lines. That made his map extremely useful for sailors. In his notes, Mercator openly said that he leaned on many sources: older world maps, his own globes, and very importantly, new sea charts made by Portuguese and Spanish captains in the Portolan style. In the 18th century, the French royal geographer Philippe Boissy pushed the southern continent idea even further. In his Carte des Terres Australes, he drew an imagined southern land split by inner seas and straits. Boissy did not have deep south survey data. Instead, he took the few reports from ships that had sailed into high southern waters and filled the rest with educated guesswork, using ideas about how continents and oceans should be arranged on a balanced globe. Modern historians treat maps like Boissy as examples of bold scientific imagination. Hancock, following earlier writers like Charles Hapgood, sees them as faint outlines of real ancient surveys that have been blurred and stretched by copying. To make sense of how information could travel across so many centuries, Hancock spends a lot of time on old centers of learning, especially the Library of Alexandria. In real history, this library and its partner institution, the Muséon, were royal research centers in the city of Alexandria in Egypt. They gathered tens of thousands of scrolls from across the known world, including travel accounts, coastal pilots, and early maps. One of the most important figures linked to that library was Eratosthenes, who served as chief librarian in the 3rd century BC. Working in Alexandria, he used reports from different cities and simple geometry to estimate the size of the Earth. His result was close to 25,000 miles around, surprisingly accurate for that time. A few centuries later, another scholar, Claudius Ptolemy, wrote a book now called The Geography. Instead of drawing just one map, He listed latitude and longitude for thousands of places, more than 6,000 in some modern counts. That list acts like a data file from the ancient world. The original map sheets are gone, but scholars today can plug Ptolemy's coordinates into computers and rebuild his view of the world. His work survived through hand-copied manuscripts in the Greek-speaking Byzantine world and was revived again in the Middle Ages by scholars such as Maximos Planudes. This is where Hancock says, "Look at what real historians already accept." Nobody doubts that Greek geographic data survived for well over 1,000 years through copying. Later, parts of Ptolemy's geography were translated into Arabic in the early Islamic world. Muslim scholars blended that Greek material with their own travel reports and made new maps of the known world. Many centuries after that, Ottoman mapmakers and European printers took this mix of Greek, Arabic, and new exploration data and turned it into atlases. Modern studies of Islamic cartography show how knowledge kept moving back and forth between cultures rather than staying in one place. Hancock connects this idea back to the maps we talked about earlier. He points out that Piri Reis said he used about 20 older charts and world maps to make his own. Some of them were Portuguese and Arabic sea charts. One of them, he said, came from Christopher Columbus and was taken from a Spanish ship around the year 1501. For Hancock, this is the opening he needs. He argues that if maps from Columbus could still be useful in the 16th century, then much older master charts could have survived in places like Alexandria, then passed into Byzantine and Islamic libraries, and finally ended up in distorted form in the hands of people like Piri Reis, Oronte Fine, Mercator, and Buache. He calls the surviving maps photocopies of work done long before written history. But this chain of copying is not unique to Hancock's favorite charts. Other strange maps have sparked the same kind of fight over what they really show. One of the most famous is the Vinland map. It appeared in the 1950s and seemed to be a medieval world map with a piece of North America marked Vinland, sitting west of Greenland. To many people, it looked like proof that someone in Europe had drawn the Americas long before Columbus, and that this knowledge had quietly survived in a library for centuries. For a long time, experts argued over whether it was real or fake. Then lab tests of the ink found a modern form of titanium pigment that did not exist in the Middle Ages. Later studies in the 2021 backed that up and said clearly that the Vinland map is a modern forgery drawn on old parchment. A different kind of puzzle hangs over the Zeno map and the island of Friesland. In the 1500s, a Venetian nobleman published a story claiming that two of his ancestors sailed the far North Atlantic in the late 1300s. Along with it, he printed a map showing a big rectangular island called Friesland between Iceland and Britain, covered with Italian-sounding place names. Later research shows that Friesland never existed. It was a phantom island, probably created or exaggerated to make those voyages look more impressive. For more than a century, other mapmakers copied Friesland onto their charts, even though there was nothing there in the real sea. Friesland is not the only phantom. Another famous example is High Brazil, a small round island that appears on many old European maps west of Ireland. In Irish legend, it was a misty, blessed place that could only be seen now and then. Mapmakers drew it again and again, sometimes as a neat circle with a line across it. Sailors later found that there was no island there at all, but the name lived on in atlases long after the myth should have faded. These ghost islands show how easily a mistake or a legend can turn into something that looks solid once it is inked onto a chart. Some controversial maps are built out of real coastlines but wrapped in bold claims. The Dieppe maps, made in a French port in the 1500s, show a huge landmass called Java la Grande between Indonesia and the far south. Some writers have argued that this is really Australia drawn long before the first recorded European landings, maybe based on secret Portuguese voyages. They point to shapes they say match parts of northern or eastern Australia, and treat the map as a hint of hidden exploration. Most map historians think the story is simpler. When they look closely at the shapes and place names, they see bits of known Southeast Asia blown up to the wrong size, twisted, and then stuck onto an imagined southern continent that many mapmakers of the time believed had to exist to balance the globe. In that reading, Java Legrand is not a clean outline of a missing continent. It is a collage of good and bad information drawn by people trying to fill blank spaces with anything that seemed to make sense. In the 2000s, a very different chart stirred up headlines. A Chinese world map that a lawyer named Liu Gang said he bought in a shop. The map is labeled as an 18th century copy of a world picture first drawn in 1418. On it, you can see rough outlines of both North and South America. Writers who believe in early Chinese global voyages have pointed to it as support for the idea that Ming Dynasty fleets reached the Americas many decades before Columbus. Many experts are not convinced. Cartographers and historians have questioned the spelling, the drawing style, and even the paper, and say the coastlines look closer to later European world maps than to any known early Ming sources. Some suggest that even if the document itself is old, it could be a creative copy that pulled in newer information and then was backdated. Others think it may simply be a modern fake made to match popular books about Chinese discovery. Either way, it has not changed the mainstream timeline of when and how the Americas were mapped. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.